How's it going? I'm Tin from Tin Max. Welcome to this retrospective on the Dead Space series. Over the past year or so, I have been covering the Dead Space franchise right here on this very channel. I have officially gotten through the entire series as it exists for the foreseeable future, so I decided to take the individual videos and slap them all together to make one big, long, comprehensive retrospective on a series I love. The videos will be presented in the same order as the videos were released, hence why the Dead Space remake is the second one I talk about. Anyway, thanks for watching, and please enjoy the rest of the video. I've said it before, and I will most definitely say it again. The Dead Space franchise is quite possibly my favorite video game series of all time. I played the first game when I was a kid, and it scared me so bad I could only get through a chapter at a time. In my defense, I was 11 when the game came out, so cut me some slack. A few years later, I played Dead Space 2, and it easily became one of my all-time favorite video games ever made. I love Dead Space 2, it's basically perfect in my eyes. But we'll get into that sometime in the future. Today is all about OG Dead Space. With the remake right around the corner, I feel like this is as good a time as any to talk about the original game and why I love it so much. The franchise as a whole means a lot to me. I even got a tattoo to show my love for this series. I've always been pretty big on sci-fi, so this creepy sci-fi horror game was right up my alley. I loved it. The terrifying creatures, the atmosphere, the setting, it all came together so well, and I fell in love with the world of Dead Space. Dead Space was pitched in 2006, around the time when EA was actually interested in creating new properties. It was created by Glenn Schofield and Michael Condrey, who both worked for Visceral Games, which at the time was called EA Redwood Shores. Visceral Games would go on to produce and develop all three mainline Dead Space games before eventually being murdered by EA, something I will still never forgive EA for, even if they're trying to revive the series. Let's be real, they're only remaking Dead Space because the Resident Evil 2 remake did so well. I'm not complaining, just feel like it's worth mentioning. Released in 2008, Dead Space was a hit, at least critically, although it did end up selling over 1 million copies by February of 2009, all thanks to its fantastic premise and setting, along with a ton of great gameplay mechanics that helped it stand out from the competition. It was fresh and new, and for the most part nails every gameplay and horror element it aims for. Now, as much as I love this game, it's not without its faults. It's not perfect. Pretty damn close, but still. Alright, well, now that we got the intro out of the way, let's talk about the game itself. The first thing I want to talk about is the enemies. Kind of a weird place to start, but I feel like the necromorphs are such an integral part of the game that they're as good a place as any to start. Also, there will be spoilers in this video, but I'll try and warn you before I get into heavy spoilers. The game is 15 years old though, so, play it already. The necromorphs are my all-time favorite versions of zombies. I guess you could technically argue that they are an alien species, which is true, but whatever, they still count. These things legitimately gave me nightmares as a kid. There was something so eerie about how human they looked. The artists for Dead Space did such a good job making each and every necromorph feel like it was created from the corpse of an actual human being. They took something we're all familiar with, the human body, and twisted it in some really disturbing ways. It almost makes them uncomfortable to look at, and there's something so effective about that. They still have recognizable human features and body parts, but they have all been broken and deformed so intensely they create these immensely deranged monsters. Watching a human corpse be perverted and warped into this horrific creature whose sole purpose is to kill still sends shivers down my spine, no matter how many times I've seen it. The sound design with the necromorphs is also creepy as hell. Despite how human they look, they definitely sound like monsters. Different noises and sounds they all make are so well done. You can tell which necromorph is after you just by the sound they make, which is just a really nice touch. A slasher enemy is going to sound different than a leaper. Plus, some of the sounds they make are just truly disturbing. I hate the exploder enemies with a passion, mostly because of the unsettling ass noise it makes. Well, that and the fact that they do a ton of damage if they can actually get to you, but mostly the sound thing. It legitimately gives me goosebumps. Another prime example of this is the Guardian Necromorph. When killed, you can hear a distinct human scream mixed in with the monster scream. That's just creepy, man. And it's made worse by the fact that you see Guardians in their immature form, and they are the most human looking things in the whole game. Adds a whole nother layer of disturbedness to the whole thing. They did really well with the sound engineering in the game. We'll get more into that in a bit, and it all just makes the necromorphs even more terrifying. Visceral Games also changed up the typical zombie formula by making the main targets on the necromorphs the limbs instead of the body or head. You can still kill them by shooting them in the head and body, but you do so much more damage by aiming for the limbs. A well-placed shot on one of the limbs can make all the difference, especially especially in the harder difficulties. This type of combat adds a lot of strategy to how you deal with each and every necromorph. For example, with slashers, I always like to take out the legs first to slow them down, then I take out the arms to finish the job. There is also a ton of variety with the different enemy types in the game. Not counting bosses and non-combative ones, there are 12 different types of necromorph you'll encounter in Dead Space, each with its own unique design and way of attacking you, and they're all terrifying, except for leapers. Leapers are kind of dumb looking. The dismemberment system is one of the things that I think helps Dead Space really stand out. It just adds so much variety to each combat encounter, especially when you start mixing into different enemy types. So many games are defined by how good its enemies are. After all, the majority of the game is spent dispatching them. In this regard, Dead Space kills it. Pun most definitely intended, and I won't apologize for it. Although I will say that one of the areas Dead Space suffers from the most is with its boss battles. They just aren't great. Spoiler warning for the boss fights in Dead Space. Skip to this time code to, skip this part. The bosses are just kind of boring to me, at least from a gameplay perspective. They look pretty sick, especially the hive mind at the end, but the problem is they just aren't interesting to play against, and not to mention that they are super easy. Each boss fight basically boils down to shooting the yellow glowing part until it dies. Final boss is especially disappointing because of this. It should be the climactic final battle with the hive mind controlling necromorphs, but it just kind of ends up being tedious then it's over, which is a shame because they hype up the hive mind earlier in the game, and like I said, it looks pretty awesome, but the actual fight against it just sucks. Overall, the necromorphs are awesome and are probably my favorite enemy type in all of video gaming. They are just so well designed, and the added dismemberment element makes them interesting to face off with. They also have a level of intelligence to them. Mind you, this intelligence is limited by 15-year-old AI, but still. The slashers will make themselves harder to hit by crouching into little horror balls. They also pretend to be dead, waiting for you to walk over them so they can surprise you. It's honestly not fooling anyone, but still, at least they tried. They'll even pretend to be dead after losing a few limbs in order to lull you into a false sense of security. It's little stuff, but I think it helps make them feel like somewhat intelligent creatures instead of just mindless zombies. The sound design in general is another thing the devs did really well. The music is intense and creepy and fits the vibe of the game perfectly. It's subtle when it needs to be while giving you massive anxiety. The music also won't kick in until you actually see a necromorph, which allows them to sneak up on you. I've played Dead Space dozens of times in my life, and I can still get jump scared because of this. There are even some moments where the lack of music is even creepier than the actual music. In some areas of the Ishimura, things will be a bit too quiet, and you can actually hear voices whispering to Isaac, which is just a great detail. Even the Ishimura itself is an accomplishment in sound design to me. You never know if the ship is creaking because of a giant zombie alien, or because the ship is just old. It's just all so well done. Speaking of well done, this is a horror game, so how well does it do with being scary? Well, I'm not sure if I'm the best judge of this at this point, to be honest. I first played this game as a literal child, and now I've played it so many times that I know all the scary bits by heart. That being said, I still think the horror in this game hits really well. There are so many intense and creepy moments that build on the already intense and creepy atmosphere of the game. Some truly disturbing things happen in this game, some of which you can miss entirely. I just love that. Plus, there's all the aspects I already talked about that elevate the horror experience of the game. The sound design will send shivers down your spine when it's not giving you massive anxiety. The necromorphs and their designs will leave a pit in your stomach. I still believe the horror of this game is incredible and will definitely scare the pants off you. That being said, if you've played this game for the first time recently, let me know how scary you actually found it to be. I would love to see what people think. This is definitely the scariest Dead Space game of the trilogy, and I think it would have been really scary for its time, but I want to know what the modern gaming audience thinks. Leave a comment down below and let me know. Alright, well now let's talk about some of the other gameplay elements. Dead Space is an over-the-shoulder, third-person horror survival game. This gave the developers of Dead Space a familiar groundwork to build upon and innovate in their own unique ways. Let's talk about one of my favorite things first. It's small, but I love it a lot. Here, look at this clip of the game and guess what I'm talking about. That's right, the user interface, UI for short. For this game, it's literally built into the world of the game rather than being an overlay over the player can see. What do I mean exactly? Look at Isaac's health bar. It's literally built right into his suit. The ammo counter for the gun is literally directly on the gun, alien style. Even when you pop open the inventory, it puts a screen right in front of your character. Same with the map and the objective menu. This adds a level of immersion to Dead Space not matched by most games. You aren't taken out of the experience whenever you need to check the map or use an item from your inventory. Even when the other characters of the game call you, they just appear as a screen in front of you. I truly love this style of UI and the immersion it provides. This level of care and innovation can be seen in all aspects of gameplay in Dead Space. Let's talk weapons real quick. Another neat little twist is that most of the guns you utilize in this game are actually tools. Faced with the horrors of the necromorphs, main character Isaac Clarke has to improvise, and that is reflected by the weapons and tools at your disposal. They were designed to have some kind of real world use outside of shooting limbs off of murderous alien zombies. For example, the most famous weapon from the whole franchise, the plasma cutter, is actually a mining tool used to cut through softer minerals. Another personal favorite of mine is the Ripper, a tool that literally launches saw blades. With the exception of the pulse rifle, all the weapons of Dead Space are some kind of tool that must be used as a weapon for the sake of survival. This is a fantastic idea from both a gameplay and lore perspective. It adds a lot of character to Isaac, which we'll get into more later. The many different weapons you can acquire throughout the game also add a ton of variety to combat and replayability. Different weapons are more suited to different enemies. You can take out a lurker with a single well-placed shot from the line gun. Every gun also has its own alt fire mode. Some are more simple than others, like the plasma cutter, which just switches between vertical and horizontal firing, but some can add a ton of strategic value, like the line gun's alt fire, which places a timed mine on the ground, which definitely comes in handy. The plasma cutter is by far my favorite weapon, and I could play through the whole game with just that gun. In fact, I have, but I definitely recommend playing around with the different weapons and tools to see which ones better suit you and your playstyle. Along with the many tools you have at your disposal, you also have the kinesis and stasis modules to spice up combat and puzzle solving. The stasis module literally lets you slow down enemies and objects for periods of time, which can give you a distinct advantage in combat. The kinesis module lets you lift objects of various sizes and weights like it's nothing. You can even launch the objects effortlessly. I think kinesis gets a big upgrade in the next game, but it still has a lot of use here, like launching conveniently placed explosive barrels to take out enemies. The stasis module becomes incredibly important against the bigger enemies like the brute and the hunter, and helps massively when you are outnumbered. Both of these things create unique gameplay elements, and they have their uses in combat and puzzle solving. And yes, there is some puzzle solving in Dead Space. It's real basic puzzle solving, but still, it's there. They help give a unique identity to the gameplay of Dead Space, and they definitely fit the sci-fi world of the game. They add a lot to the gameplay and help Dead Space stand out amongst its horror shooter brethren. With all this being said, I should probably talk about some of the gameplay elements that just don't really work for me. The game is the first in the series, so obviously a lot of the systems introduced here are improved upon in later games, but those improvements are dearly missed when revisiting this game. The zero-G sections aren't offensive or anything, but the floating and flying utilized in the later games feels much better and is much more fun. Also, sometimes when you do the zero-G jumps, you can get very disoriented and it can be very confusing. Luckily, you have your handy dandy locator, which will literally show you the path you need to take to get to your next destination, which, trust me, I love, because I forget where I'm going just about every 5 seconds. The problem with the locator in this game is when you activate it, the camera forces you to look at the ground in front of you, which sometimes makes you miss where you actually need to go. This is more of a nitpick than anything, but it can be really annoying at times. Another thing that hasn't aged well in my opinion, especially after playing the later games, is how clunky Isaac is and how clunky kinesis is. In Dead Space, when you pick up items with kinesis, it can very slowly drag its way into the correct position. In the later games, anything you pick up with kinesis basically snaps instantly into place. Isaac himself also feels slower and clunkier than later games. I realize this is due to quality of life improvements made with hindsight, but still, it does show Dead Space's age a bit. These little negatives I mentioned definitely aren't enough to ruin the overall experience. They're mostly just small things that can be a tad frustrating at times. For the most part, Dead Space still feels like a AAA game you could release today. Outside of a few small areas, it has aged really well. Granted, it's not really that old in the first place. It's a super fun horror game with gameplay that still feels unique and interesting 15 years later, which is an accomplishment in itself. Next, let's get into the story of Dead Space. I think it's best to break up this part of the video into two different parts: the world and the world building that Dead Space presents, and the actual story of the game. One of the things I love about the whole Dead Space franchise is the world the games take place in. From the first game, and even through the marketing of the first game, Dead Space has done an excellent job with its world building. The universe feels real because they put so much thought into every detail they could, whether it's through audio logs you find scattered around the Ishimura to the posters and warnings you see around the environments. If you're a fan of the games and you can find it, check out The Art of Dead Space. It's a book featuring a ton of concept art and little snippets about how the game and its art direction came together. The lore of Dead Space runs deep, and it all starts with this game. The universe and the way it looks is just so deliberate and precise. Everything has a reason and explanation. Even the main setting of the game, the USG Ishimura, was designed in such a way that it feels both super futuristic and advanced while also feeling old and creaky. The art directors wanted the ship to feel like it could actually exist. They wanted every area you visit to feel like it makes sense and has a very specific function, and that shows within the game. The locations the game takes you all feel like they have a purpose both within the story being told and outside of it, if that makes any sense. The world feels complete in its representation, and that's one of the marks of a great game world. Also, the USG Ishimura looks insanely cool. I love the aesthetic of the ship, and of course the atmosphere is really well done. This is as good a time as any to mention that this game looks great, even for a 15-year-old game. The graphics at the time were exceptional, and because of that they hold up really well today, even with how much they've aged. The game can be a bit buggy at times, and the physics are janky as hell. I had to restart a chapter at one point because the game launched me into the ceiling, so that was kind of annoying, but also pretty funny. Also, the ragdoll moments of the corpses can create some unintentionally funny moments, so neither of these aspects are enough to take away from the horror of the game. Every location you explore in Ishimura is nightmarish and will have you apprehensive to turn each corner. It's definitely one of the most iconic settings in all of horror gaming, or at least it is to me. There's also the element of the Unitologists, a crazed cult that worships something called a marker. We'll get a bit more into that in spoilers, but I think the game does a good job establishing them through all the secrets and audio logs you can discover throughout the game. Doing this also gives you a great insight into what all went wrong on the ship before you arrived. I mean, aside from the killer monsters swarming everywhere. There are whole characters and side stories that you can learn about by finding and listening to the audio logs, like one of the Ishimura's engineers who is desperately trying to keep the ship together while everything is falling apart around him. It just adds so much to the game and the world building. Plus, you can listen to the audio logs while moving through the game, which should be the default for all games, honestly. I am way more likely to listen and pay attention to audio logs if I can play them while I'm exploring, rather than just staring at the menu. I'm looking at you, Callisto Protocol. Anyway, the story of Dead Space is pretty straightforward, or at least the surface level of the story is. The USG Ishimura, a planet cracker, is on an illegal mining trip to the forbidden planet Aegis 7. After the CEC, Concordance Extraction Corporation, loses contact with Ishimura, they send a small team to investigate. That team includes our protagonist Isaac Clarke, who is an engineer, which explains his proficiencies with all tools used as weapons. Isaac's girlfriend Nicole was aboard the Ishimura, so his personal mission is to find her. Once they board the Ishimura, they find that the crew has all been turned into murderous monsters, the Necromorphs. That's the basic outline of the plot, so this is your final warning going forward about heavy spoilers. Overall, I like the main story and the world of the game, and I definitely think it's worth experiencing. Now, I'm gonna dive into specifics about the story and what I like and don't like about it, so if you don't want any spoilers, then this is your chance to dip out or skip to this time code. That was your final warning. Alright, on to spoilers for this 15-year-old game. The first thing about the story I want to mention is that a majority of the game has you going on pretty simple fetch quests. This isn't the most compelling type of objective, but honestly they work in this game simply because all the things you need to do take you to the various interesting and terrifying corners of the Ishimura. This really helps it from feeling super repetitive, so in that regard it's pretty forgivable. It also doesn't affect the pacing of the game in any negative way, at least as far as I'm concerned. The majority of the game takes place aboard the Ishimura and has you exploring the ship to find all the different doodads you need to fix it and try to escape the madness. You will also revisit certain areas of the ship multiple times, but the game does a pretty decent job of making you feel fresh each time by adding new obstacles and enemies. Now let's talk about characters. Isaac is the main character and the best character in the whole franchise. That being said, in this game he is a silent protagonist, which just means he doesn't speak.
How many times you watched that thing? Guess you really miss her.
And that's a really bizarre choice to me. It feels out of place in the game meant to be this realistic. He doesn't speak or react to anything outside of body language, and even then that doesn't happen many times throughout the game. One of the twists of the game is that Nicole is dead despite Isaac seeing her. And it's just super weird that Isaac doesn't say anything to her the first time he sees her or when he finds out she's actually dead. It also means that he has basically no personality in the game. He's just kind of along for the ride. This is remedied in future games, and I love Isaac mostly because of those games, but it's still very bizarre here. This is one of the things that Remake aims to add to the game. Isaac will be fully voiced in the remake, and it has been rewritten with that in mind. That might honestly be the thing I'm most excited about with the remake. In this game, Isaac is just kind of a blank slate. Speaking of blank slates, the rest of the characters aren't all that great either. You have the other two crew members that survive along with Isaac, Kendra and Hammond, and a couple of surviving crewmates, a good doctor and a bad doctor. Kendra and Hammond aren't exactly bad characters, I just don't think they're all that interesting. Hammond is the leader of the mission and a more typical military/company type guy, and Kendra is there to whine and eventually betray Isaac. Both of them just kind of pop up to give Isaac objectives, then disappear again until they have something else for you to do. Kendra does get more play than Hammond, simply because she makes it to the end of the game and, like I mentioned, was actually a part of the mission in order to grab the marker for EarthGov. She's also the one that tells Isaac that Nicole is really dead, so she sucks and I hate her. There's also Good Doctor and Bad Doctor, and yes, I know their names, I just don't care. Bad Doctor is there to inconvenience you like twice, and Good Doctor is there to help you like twice, so I guess that balances out. Not really anything interesting about them, they just kind of exist for plot reasons, and that's all. Although, to be fair, their characters, and others, do get some deeper storytelling if you listen to the audio logs. In fact, I recommend collecting all the audio logs throughout the game because they help flesh out a lot of details of the story. All that might make it seem like I don't really like the story of this game, but that's not the case. I just personally find the characters to be a bit underwhelming. One of the coolest aspects of the story is the marker, a supposedly alien artifact which could potentially create limitless energy. The one side effect of it being that it drives people crazy and turns dead people into alien zombie monsters made from reanimated flesh. So, no biggie. Remember how earlier I said that Isaac meets Nicole despite her being dead? That's because Isaac is slowly losing his mind thanks to the influence of the marker. The marker causes people to hallucinate and drives them mad. It uses this ability to either manipulate people into doing its bidding or killing themselves horrifically. That's what Nicole is in this game, a hallucination with the sole purpose of messing with Isaac. I love this whole angle of the game and the larger franchise. The madness and hallucinations induced by the marker add a whole new layer of horror that mixes perfectly with the body and zombie horror of the rest of the game. The markers are awesome, and I love them. It's hands down the best part of the story in my opinion. Overall, I think the story of Dead Space is pretty good. It's not spectacular or anything, but it gets the job done and sets up a fantastic world. The deeper into the story you get, the more interesting and fascinating it gets. I think the characters do suffer from being underdeveloped, but everything surrounding them makes up for it and even goes beyond. The surface story of the game is a little weak, but it goes way deeper than it first seems, and has a lot of fun little twists and surprises in it. I still really don't like the decision to make Isaac a silent protagonist. Like I said, it just feels so out of place in the world they are presenting us with. It's made worse by the fact that he is fully voiced in the next two games. I kinda get why they would do that, to add to the feeling of being alone and isolated, but it's just not worth it. I honestly find it distracting. Now it's time to wrap up this review type thing. I still really like the first Dead Space game. It's not my favorite in the series, that honor goes to Dead Space 2, but it does a lot of things right and obviously sets the groundwork for the future of the franchise. Not everything about it holds up as well today, but I do think that 95% of it does. In my personal opinion, the base story is the weakest in the series, but it isn't all bad. Even as much as I complained about the characters, it doesn't ruin the experience or anything. It's a horror game, so scares, gore, and atmosphere are way more important, and Dead Space goes above and beyond in every other aspect of the game. The gameplay is still insanely fun, and even with the several times I've played through this game, it can still make me jump at times. I absolutely recommend it if you have never played it and you love the horror genre or just games that are really good. It's a classic for a reason, and while the remake looks promising, this game was already damn near perfect. I'll be the first to admit that I might have been a bit skeptical about this remake. Mostly because of EA's track record with screwing over Dead Space and the fact that Dead Space doesn't really need a remake. I still stand by that. But despite that, I still had faith in the actual developers of the remake. From the very beginning, they were completely open and upfront with the fans of the series about what they were doing and wanted to do. They did their developer streams to showcase new ideas and improvements they were implementing. From little ones to how sound was being handled to bigger concepts like the peeling system. They clearly wanted fans to know that they were putting thought and care into this remake, and thankfully it shows in the final product. This game is a prime example of what remakes should be, and I absolutely loved every second of it. Now, this should go without saying, but knowing the internet, I'm gonna say it anyway. Just because this game is good and different doesn't mean the original Dead Space just stops existing. People can still love the original while also loving this remake. Crazy concept, I know, but it's true. I love Dead Space so very, very much, and I recently did a video on just how good that game is. Yes, this is a plug for that video, but also it's important to know that the original game is absolutely amazing. The first game being as good as it is means that the developers of this remake already had a great groundwork to build upon. Honestly, if they just did a 1-for-1 of the original Dead Space just with better graphics and improved gameplay, then it already would have been pretty great. Much more pointless, but still. Dead Space is a classic, and that's because it's an inherently good game. It may have aged a bit since 2008, but it still holds up pretty well these days. Thankfully, EA Motive did more than just copy and paste the OG game with better graphics and a better engine. They improved the game in a ton of very noticeable and significant ways. This may be a bit controversial, but I do think this is a better version of the game in total, especially for people who have never played a Dead Space game before. This is Dead Space translated for the modern audience. Okay, I'll actually start talking about the game now, and what better place to start than the most obvious improvement, the graphics. This game looks scary good. Everyone involved in this should be so proud of themselves because they completely nailed the look and aesthetics of the Dead Space universe while also making everything look significantly better. They took every object and surface and room and area of Ishimura and rebuilt it from the ground up with way more detail. They did this while also making sure it all stayed true to the original design and did so masterfully. Every area you explore feels less empty and therefore the ship feels more authentic. While deciding how to redesign things, they made sure to keep in mind all the goals and ideas that played such an important role in the look of the first game. I'm not a graphics snob by any means, but this game looks phenomenal and I loved exploring Ishimura and revisiting every corner of the ship because it all felt so new. You almost don't even recognize some rooms because they just look so much better. The amount of detail present in every aspect of this game is insane. It's also not just the graphics that have been upgraded, but also the design of the ship itself is more streamlined than ever before. While still present, the tram system is no longer required for moving through the different areas of the ship. You can literally walk your way across the whole of the Ishimura without seeing a loading screen. Small areas have been added to connect all the areas we're already familiar with, and were done so with purpose. The ship has also been somewhat redesigned with this in mind. The layout of the Ishimura is definitely different, but all the components are still present, just with slightly different arrangements and placements. All of these changes were made with practicality in mind. They help the layout of the ship make much more sense and feel more real. It is still very much the same Ishimura, with some slight to less slight changes made to fit this version of the game. None of the classic areas that you love are missing. They just might not be right where they used to be. Plus, there's the new security clearance thing that changes how you explore and unlock bonus areas and rooms. It even provides an in-game reason why you can access lockers later in the game that you couldn't earlier in the game. It's a pretty great addition and changes up how you explore the ship. I would be remiss to talk about a Dead Space game and not mention the sound design. As always, it is pretty much on point. A lot of that is due to the fact that they stayed very true to the original sound design with this remake. The music hits the same vibes and evokes the same reactions, you still get the voices whispering to Isaac throughout the game, and you still get the tension that comes with not knowing exactly where a sound is coming from and what's making it. In fact, I feel like they did a better job of adding in sounds off in the distance that make you question if it's just a ship creaking because it's old, or if it's a murder zombie alien out for your ass. The Alive system also adds a ton of realism and tension by changing how Isaac reacts to different situations. If your health is low, then his breathing gets heavier and you can hear his heart beating from the stress. It goes way deeper than that and is way more complicated than that, but I'm not getting into it. It's a lot to explain. It's pretty cool, is my point, and it adds a lot to the more intense moments in the game. I could probably do without the heartbeat thing. I just found it to be distracting, honestly. It doesn't hurt the game, I just don't love it. Another thing I don't love, and this might honestly be my biggest complaint about the game, is the sounds of the necromorphs. In the video I did on the original Dead Space, I mentioned how I love the sound design for the necromorphs, and specifically mentioned the Exploder and the Guardians as standout examples. Unfortunately with this remake, I just feel like the noises from the necromorphs, those two in particular, just don't hit the same, like at all. They are definitely worse, and it's most noticeable with the Exploder. They just didn't affect me in this game like they do in the other games, and I think the sound design is the reason why. It's just worse. They still suck because of the whole big exploding sack thing, but they don't send shivers down my spine when they show up. All the necromorphs seem quieter, and all the screams and grunts and all that just aren't as effective as they used to be. At the end of the day, it's not a massive deal, but it still kind of sucks since that was such a cool part of the original game. Now, the sound design for the necromorphs may be worse, but they have never looked better and felt more like a threat. I played this game on medium, and it felt much harder than the normal difficulty of the old game. Maybe I was just off my game, but the enemies seemed harder to kill. They took way more damage and felt more unstoppable. It also seemed like resources were harder to come by. Money was definitely more scarce. I struggled in this game more than I ever struggled in the original Dead Space, even on the harder difficulties. And that honestly made it more fun and scary. Each encounter with the necromorphs felt more like a life or death situation, and that made each encounter more intense. The necromorphs are also more terrifying than ever thanks to the massive graphical leap. They are way more disturbing to look at, and the peeling system that literally lets you blow chunks of flesh off their bones is gnarly in all the right ways. Additionally, it adds a bit to gameplay and incentivizes precise aiming. You'll get those limbs off a lot easier if you can strike the bone directly. The actual designs of the necromorphs haven't really changed all that much, except for the Weezers, who are way more disturbing than before, but that's okay because they already looked terrifying. Everything I've ever said about how great the necromorphs look and the gut-wrenching body horror they provide is still very true, if not even more so thanks to the whole game just looking significantly better. Plus, you can literally blow all the flesh from their bones and still have them coming at you as basically just a skeleton monster. It looks insanely cool and is insanely creepy. I love it so very much. The peeling system was a stroke of genius. I feel like they also built some of the weapon improvements with the peeling system in mind. Specifically the force gun, which is the weapon I just mentioned that is capable of blasting all of the flesh off enemies in one shot. In fact, most of the guns in the game have been modified to be more strategic, at least when it comes to their alt fires. The pulse rifle alt fire is now a proximity mine that explodes when enemies get too close. On top of that, it doubles as a grenade launcher when you just shoot the mine directly at enemies. This is a massive improvement over the weird over the head shooting in a circle thing that it used to do. Pretty much every weapon in the game now has a new alt fire that changes how they can be used in fights, except for the plasma cutter, which was already perfect. The flamethrower, for example, can create a wall of fire to keep enemies away, and that can be incredibly useful. I don't really have any problem with the new alts, and I think they did a great job fixing them. What's more is you don't have to buy the guns anymore. In more typical survival horror fashion, you find and unlock the guns as you make your way through the game. This helps space them out more and gives you more time to use them before deciding which ones you prefer. It's neat and I like it. Overall, the gameplay is just better than it used to be. They even fixed the ADS section by completely reworking it. The boss fights are also much better than before, which is great because that was one of my biggest complaints with the original game. I also love the fact that you can change the controls to match Dead Space 2's button layout, because that was always my favorite. They also brought in the impalement mechanic from Dead Space 2, where you can use kinesis to launch long sharp objects at enemies to take them out, including their own limbs and blades. It doesn't feel as overpowered in this game as it did in Dead Space 2, but honestly I think that's kind of a good thing. You can't strictly rely on that to instantly kill them. They also added more objects into the game that could be launched, like pipes and fan blades. This is something you could technically do in the original game, but it's much more effective this time around. Unfortunately, kinesis is clunkier than it is in Dead Space 2. It can be very inconsistent when trying to grab specific objects, and it can be annoying at times. So many times I was just trying to grab an enemy's claw to throw at another enemy, and it would grab the whole corpse when all I wanted was the stabby bit. Maybe they could fix it with a patch or something, but even if they don't, it's more annoying than game ruining. Furthermore, there are some completely new elements of gameplay, like the circuit breakers, which let you reroute power to different things like doors or lights. I found this to be a really creative addition to the game. There are several instances where you're forced to choose how you rewrite the power and what consequences that creates. For example, you may have to take the power away from the lights or life support in order to get where you need to go, so it's up to you which you would rather lose. The choice is to continue in complete darkness, but be able to breathe fine, or keep the lights on, but now run the risk of suffocating. It's brilliant and does a lot to boost the horror of the game. Speaking of horror, this game is definitely terrifying. As a longtime fan of Dead Space that has played the original game dozens of times, I had a great time with this game in that regard. I haven't been this freaked out by a Dead Space game since I played Dead Space 1 as a literal child. Despite how familiar the whole game is, you never know what has changed, and that meant I never truly knew what to expect, which was very exciting for me. In fact, that could be said about the game as a whole. The game felt familiar enough while simultaneously being a whole new beast. All the new elements and changes eventually add up to make this feel like a brand new experience. Developers did a fantastic job of achieving this while still honoring and adhering to the core of the original game. This isn't just Dead Space remade, it's Dead Space reborn. I personally think this is what makes a remake great. It gives you an experience that is familiar and nostalgic while at the same time giving you something completely new. With that in mind, I think this game is basically a perfect remake and sets an example that should be followed in the future. Especially if we're going to keep getting remakes for games that don't necessarily need them. Developers shouldn't be afraid to try new things and innovate where they can. That's what makes for better games. EA Motive accomplished that here, and the result is a fantastic game that honors and respects its original source material, but still manages to make a name for itself too. Even the changes to the story don't feel forced or illogical. Nothing they changed or added felt frivolous or pointless. They expanded and added to the existing story and improved the overarching story by doing so. Just the fact that Isaac can actually speak this time around is enough to make it fresh and new, but Motive didn't stop there. There are now little extra side quests you can do that are pretty simple and straightforward, but add some depth to certain story aspects and characters that were kind of neglected in the first game. Plus, some of this new stuff helps the game fit better in the larger story of the Dead Space universe. Less of the big plot points are hidden behind audio and text logs this time around. I won't get into details because whether you're a new player picking up their first Dead Space game or a longtime fan of the series, you should experience it for yourself. I quite like the changes and additions they made to the story, and I personally think it's the definitive way to see the story play out. As far as I'm concerned, they didn't ruin any of the characters or their arcs. In fact, all the characters seem to be more developed this time around, especially Nicole. Some of the faces might be a bit weird, but the actual characterization has been improved, so I'm okay with it. It just feels like a more complete and fulfilling story in total, and as a big fan of the series, it was great to be a part of that. Look, at the end of the day, I love this game. It's fantastic and sets a high bar for remakes in the future. I'm just so impressed by how they managed to give me something so nostalgic that was also something completely new. I would genuinely love to see what they could do with Dead Space 2, and that's saying something. I'm way more protective of that game than Dead Space 1, but I definitely wouldn't mind seeing a remake if they can put this level of care into it as well. Overall, I do think this is definitively the best way to play Dead Space. It's more modern and more accessible and probably more new player friendly. That being said, however, don't skip the original Dead Space if you haven't played it yet. This remake is great, but a large part of that is due to how overwhelmingly good the original game is. If you haven't played the original Dead Space, then you still should, even if you've already played this. They are different enough that I for sure think it's worth experiencing them both, even just to see how much they did change in this remake. I also hope this game does well because I just want to see more Dead Space, period. That's all I've wanted since EA killed the franchise in the first place. Now I wouldn't put it past EA to f this up too, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. Dead Space 2 is the best game in the series, or at least it is in my humble opinion. I love this game so much. It's easily my favorite Dead Space game, Remake included, and it's one of my favorite games of all time. I just feel like Visceral Games absolutely knocked it out of the park with this one. In fact, they didn't just knock it out of the park, they knocked it out of the solar system. I feel like sequels to brand new games, like Dead Space was at the time, are always a proving ground for the series. It's where you find out if it truly has the potential of being a series, or if it was just a one-time lightning in a bottle kind of thing. Sure, you made an amazing game that a lot of people love, but can you do it again but bigger and better? The answer isn't always yes, and sometimes a sequel pales in comparison to its predecessor. Sometimes developers or publishers or whoever you want to blame take the wrong lessons from the success of a game and make something that just misses the mark entirely. Like Devil May Cry 2, which on paper seemed like it would be a good follow-up, but just fell completely flat in every department. It can be a tricky balancing act. You have to recapture everything people loved in the first game while also letting the sequel have an identity of its own. It needs to add enough new stuff so it doesn't feel like glorified DLC, while also not being different enough that it feels like a different game entirely. Be it story, gameplay, or graphics, there has to be improvement in some or all of these areas. Obviously, what makes a good sequel can vary from person to person, but I feel like most people can agree that just doing the same thing again is just kind of boring. For me personally, Dead Space 2 is the perfect example of a sequel that just nails every aspect of being a sequel. As far as I'm concerned, Visceral Games created a perfect sequel with this game. So, in this video, I want to talk about all the things I love about Dead Space 2 and explain why I think it's the best game in the series. So let's go ahead and actually do that. Before we really get into it, there won't be spoilers for this game until the end, but I am going into this video assuming we're all aware of what happened in the first game. If you aren't, then don't panic. I already made a video about that game that you can check out to learn everything you need to know. Feel free to watch that, then come right back here to finish this video. I don't mind. Alright, we good? Good. The first thing I want to talk about with this game is the gameplay. Dead Space 2 basically improves every aspect of gameplay the first Dead Space established. Now I realize that's a hefty claim, but I can say that with a lot of confidence because I have played both games extensively. To be fair, the developers already had a fantastic groundwork in place from the first game. Despite being more than 15 years old at this point, the gameplay of Dead Space 1 has aged incredibly well. It still feels great to play, and they did a lot that innovated the survival horror genre in some really interesting ways. The stasis and kinesis modules helped give Dead Space's gameplay an identity of its own that helped it stand out from its contemporaries. Dead Space 2 carries over all the mechanics and gameplay elements from Dead Space and improves nearly all of them. Some in more noticeable ways than others, but I think pretty much everything is upgraded to a certain degree. Even the way Isaac moves within the gameplay is quicker and significantly less clunky, which makes the overall gameplay smoother. Stasis is relatively unchanged aside from the fact that it will now recharge over time, so you no longer have to rely on stasis packs as much. Don't get me wrong, you will still need them since the timed recharge isn't going to do you much good when you're being overwhelmed. Stasis packs also stack in inventory now, which is a small touch, but one that I really appreciate. Kinesis has also got a massive upgrade for Dead Space 2. While you could technically throw the limbs of enemies back at them in Dead Space 1, it didn't have a lot of practical use. It could be done, but wasn't really worth doing. At least for me, I never bothered with it. However, in this game, it has been beefed up and is easily one of the most effective ways to kill your enemies. Dead Space 2 allows you to use the blades and claws of dead enemies to impale other enemies. This is a super fun addition to the combat that will change how you approach each enemy encounter. It can also save you a ton of ammo if used properly, which is a pretty great bonus. Kinesis is more instant this time around too. Items you grab snap into position immediately as opposed to the slow drag that they would sometimes do in Dead Space 1. This is another instance of gameplay just being quicker and more responsive, making it all feel smoother. Even the remake doesn't do kinesis as well as it's done in this game. You are almost always guaranteed to grab the item or object you are attempting to grab with kinesis first try, much less grabbing the entire body rather than the stabby bit you actually want. Even the locator system got a bit of an upgrade. You can now change what the locator is currently locating, which means you can use it to find stores, benches, and save points, along with whatever your current objective is. I don't use this feature a ton due to the more linear nature of the game, but it definitely comes in handy every once in a while. Probably the biggest change to gameplay is the completely reworked and upgraded 0G sections. Dead Space 1 had you space jumping from flat surface to flat surface, and that was fine, I guess. Dead Space 2 is where the 0G sections were changed to a floating and flying system that, in my opinion, is just a lot more fun. It's very Iron Man, and I like it significantly more than in jumping about. It can still be very disorienting, but you can realign yourself with the ground with a simple simple press of a button. And again, Dead Space 2 does this better than the remake. In the remake, the reorienting is slow and doesn't really work all the time. I feel like I have to press and hold the button to get it to work properly. Here, you just press it and Isaac instantly aligns with the ground. It's probably less realistic this way or whatever, but it's much nicer from a gameplay perspective. The zero-G sections in general are more robust and interesting to play through this time around thanks to this big change. I don't know, I just think it's a lot more fun to fly around in a completely 3D space than awkwardly jump from one spot to another. I mean, they changed the zero-G sections to play like this in the remake, so I think it's safe to say it's the more popular choice, even though they did it worse in the remake. On top of all those changes, they also added new weapons and enemies to spice up the gameplay even more. One of the new weapons is my second favorite gun in the whole series, and that is the wonderful javelin gun. It's kind of like a harpoon gun if you could shoot electricity through the harpoon after it's been fired. It's just insanely satisfying to use in combat, and I really enjoy shocking the corpses of my enemies. In addition to the javelin gun, there's also the seeker rifle, which is the closest thing to a sniper rifle Dead Space is ever going to get, and the detonator, which is pretty much a standard mine launcher. All the original guns from Dead Space return, and a couple of them have even been modified to suck less. The pulse rifle's alt fire has been altered to being just a regular old grenade launcher rather than that dumb over the head circle thing from before. A little more of a basic alt fire, sure, but a much more practical one. The returning of new weapons still help keep each combat encounter fresh and exciting, especially if you switch up what weapons you've got on you. This is an instance of not fixing what isn't broken, and it was definitely the right call to just add a few new weapons rather than changing how the weapons worked entirely. Cough cough, Dead Space 3, cough cough. Along with the new guns, there are some new necromorphs, and again, this is an example of just adding to what already worked great. There aren't a ton of new enemies, but there are enough added to the game to make combat encounters even more diverse than Dead Space 1. You have the puker enemies, which have a long-range spitting attack that pretty much acts as stasis on Isaac. If you get hit with it, your movement is significantly slowed down, and this gives the necromorphs the advantage. There are also the new stalker enemies that attack in larger areas where they can utilize group tactics to distract and flank Isaac. The AI with these guys can be a bit finicky, but they can do a lot of damage if you aren't careful. I love these guys because it really enforces the idea of the necromorphs being somewhat intelligent. Again, the AI can be a bit finicky, but they still manage to stress me out every time I have to deal with them. Even the Leapers are more of a threat in this game. In OG Dead Space, Leapers were kinda silly looking when they jumped around, and I honestly couldn't take them seriously. In Dead Space 2, however, I have to take them seriously because if I don't, they will absolutely wreck my health. Maybe it's just my imagination, but I think they are much more aggressive and more efficient in this game, which in turn makes them more trouble to deal with. Once again, this is Visceral just improving what worked great in the first game. They didn't have to reinvent the wheel, they just gave us some new and unique necromorphs along with the old ones to fight for our lives against. A good sequel builds on what worked great the first time, and this is a perfect example of that. The necromorphs are one of the best aspects of the Dead Space games, and they did such a great job of building on said aspect in the sequel. There's enough new elements and changes to make it feel fresh and different while simultaneously feeling familiar and recognizable. Visceral did an amazing job of balancing those concepts with Dead Space 2, and that's a big part of why I love it so much. Now, a big question that comes with a sequel to anything horror related is it as scary as the first one? The answer is honestly no. I can pretty safely say that overall Dead Space 2 isn't as scary as Dead Space 1, at least as long as you've played Dead Space 1 already. I don't really count that against the game, however, because it's something that is fundamentally difficult to accomplish in horror in general. The thing with scary movies and games and whatnot is that the scary aspects tend to lose their effectiveness the more they are used. A lot of what makes horror actually scary is the unknown and surprising elements utilized, and once those things are no longer unknown or surprising, then they are no longer as scary. Therefore, the horror of Dead Space 2 isn't going to hit as hard or be as effective the second time around. Does that mean the game isn't still scary at all? Of course not. There are still new unknowns and surprises to experience, but at the end of the day, you've seen a lot of this before if you played the first game. It's just less scary overall. I'm also not the best judge of how scary Dead Space 2 is for the same reasons I mentioned in my Dead Space video. I've played this game so many times that I know pretty much everything that happens. I hope what I said made some kind of sense, but if it didn't, just know that while it's not as scary as the first game, there is still plenty of horror in Dead Space 2. In fact, there's a new-ish facet of the horror that I believe is used better in this game than the first one. Before we get into that, this is a reminder that we're going to be talking about the story of Dead Space 1 and the effects it has on the story of Dead Space 2. If you haven't played the first game and don't want it spoiled, then skip ahead or watch my video on that game. Same thing applies to anyone who wants to experience the story of Dead Space 2 as unspoiled as possible. While not major story points or spoilers, I do want to talk about some stuff that may be considered spoilish to some, so dip out now if that applies to you. The events of Dead Space 1 and his exposure to the marker has left Isaac's mind completely broken. The death of Nicole and the effects of the marker messing with his brain has given Isaac a special case of space dementia, which causes him to hallucinate. Throughout the events of Dead Space 2, Isaac is haunted by the memories of his dead girlfriend and the guilt of her death. I love this a ton because I feel like it adds so much to not only the horror and the creepiness of Dead Space 2, but also the character of Isaac Clarke. The story of Dead Space 2 is a much more personal journey compared to OG Dead Space because it's all about him facing what he believes to be his failure to save Nicole, and the loneliness that would come with accepting her death. Well, that and the fact that he actually talks and has a personality this time.
It's okay. How you doing?
The hallucinations he confronts are some of the creepiest and most terrifying moments in the game. It's much more than just voices whispering in your ear during quiet moments. One of my favorite characteristics of the marker is how it messes with people and manipulates them using their own thoughts and feelings. You get a taste of that in the first game and much more so in the remake, but Dead Space 2 dives right into the deep end and it's incredible. I just think the psychological torment of the marker and its mindfucking works so well combined with the physical body horror of the necromorphs. They really complement and play off each other in a lot of interesting ways that makes the game scarier as a whole. Hallucinations caused by the marker lead to some of the best moments in the entire series. I mean, the big twist in the first game is thanks to the marker and its mind games. Even without the bigger emphasis on hallucinations and psychological horror, there are a ton of really terrifying parts of Dead Space 2. One of the most bone-chilling sections of the game has you traveling through an elementary school in the midst of a necromorph outbreak. The Church of Unitology is also a really eerie location to explore, and now that I'm thinking about it, maybe we should finally talk about the story and locations of Dead Space 2. Quick thoughts for those of you who just want to know if the story is good. Yes it is. It's more straightforward than the story of Dead Space 1, but that doesn't make it worse. The world building is still there, but feels less special, and I think a big part of that is due to the location of the game being much bigger. Rather than the majority of the game taking place on one ship, Dead Space 2 takes place on a massive space station and has you moving through several different locations within it. So the world building is less focused simply because you spend less time in the various areas. Like I mentioned earlier, Isaac speaks now, so he feels like he has a much bigger impact on the story and therefore has more urgency as a character. The game overall is more of an action horror game than a survival horror game, and I think a big part of that is the more cinematic presentation of the game. The cutscenes play out in a more standard way than Dead Space 1, but I think it works really well for this game and the story being told. The story is bigger in scope and adds a lot of really cool bits of lore to the universe that builds brilliantly off the concepts that Dead Space 1 introduced. I think this game is a prime example of taking the story and lore from its predecessor and expanding it in a way that makes sense. The story in this game is a thrilling continuation of the first that is immensely satisfying to experience. I really love the world building they did in this game, and that is yet another area that Dead Space 2 excels in. Similar to OG Dead Space's baseline story, Dead Space 2's main story isn't the most interesting part of the game. The more interesting part of the story is the world of the game and the lore it provides. Dead Space as a series just has some of the best lore and world building in any horror franchise ever. I'm a bit biased because I played as a kid and sci-fi is just my favorite genre of anything ever, but still, Dead Space in general is just an amazing combination of cosmic horror, body horror, zombie horror, and psychological horror, all wrapped up neatly with great aesthetics and an engrossing overarching story. Dead Space 2 is an important part of all that, because this is the game where they really started to expand the world and lore. Sure, you had spin-offs like Extraction that explore the events of Dead Space from a new and different perspective, but Dead Space 2 is where the larger universe of the games got introduced. You finally get to see more of the universe outside of the Ishimura and Aegis 7. Okay, with that out of the way, let's dig a little deeper into some of the story's details. Final warning for spoilers about Dead Space 2 because I'm about to go all in on the story. I'm not holding anything back past this point in the video, so just be aware. Let's start with the location of the game, Titan Station. Also known as the Sprawl, it is a space station built on what is left of one of Saturn's moons. Now, admittedly, the Sprawl isn't as iconic as Ishimura, but I do think it has one major advantage over it: variety. Don't get me wrong, the Ishimura does a lot with its setting and takes you to some really interesting areas of the ship, but ultimately it's just one mining vessel. The Sprawl, however, can take you through a hospital, an elementary school, a crazy people church, and underground moon mines, and it doesn't even need a tram to do it. Except for that one time, I guess. Granted, you don't spend as much time in each of these locations, but that's honestly fine with me. The game does a great job of keeping you moving through the Sprawl at a clip, so you spend just the right amount of time in each area. You get to experience what there is to experience, then you move on to the next location. At one point, you even revisit Ishimura in what is one of the coolest sections of any video game ever. After the events of Dead Space, EarthGov recovered Ishimura and brought it to the Sprawl to be repaired and refurbished. During the story, Isaac has to make his way through the Ishimura, and it's easily one of the best parts of the whole game. It's just insanely cool to explore the Ishimura in this context, and it's one of the creepiest and most disturbing parts of the game. I love seeing how they tried to cover and hide the scars of what really went on the ship, and it almost feels like walking through a haunted house. From a story perspective, it's an important moment for Isaac since he is literally forced to revisit the source of his trauma.
Ellie, I'm in. There should still be a computer in the flight lounge. I can check the ship's status from there.
Are you okay? You sound a little nervous.
Last time I was here, things didn't go so well. Look, I'll contact you soon.
It also does a lot to just show how much bigger the sprawl is in comparison. You can even see the Ishimura a few times in the background before you properly revisit it, which is a nice reward for people paying attention. This is one of my favorite sections of the whole game, and I couldn't find a better place in the video to bring it up, so there you go. Now, I'm not going to do a full breakdown of the story. I just don't really want to. Rather, I just want to talk about some of the aspects and story beats that I actually have something to say about. Plus, this is the spoiler part of the video, so you probably already know what happens in the story anyway. First, I want to say I really like the inclusion of Ellie and Strauss. I have no idea if this was intentional or if I'm just reading too much into it, but I feel like those two characters represented two different sides of Isaac. With Ellie, you have a regular person just trying to survive an outbreak of monsters and demons. She's smart, resourceful, and most of all, she's a survivor. She reflects those aspects of Isaac. Whereas with Strauss, you have a crazed shell of a man whose psyche has been completely broken by the Marker's influence. Much like Isaac, Strauss is dealing with feelings of guilt and failure due to the death of his wife and son, who he killed with his own hands thanks to the Marker's dementia. If Ellie is the reflection of sane regular Isaac, then Strauss is the reflection of Isaac's internal struggle. Like I said, I might just be reading too much into it, but I think it makes for an interesting discussion nonetheless. Maybe I'll start doing lore videos just to see if there's any weight to this idea. If you played the game, then let me know what you think of this theory down below. The other important part of the story I want to talk about is how Dead Space 2 deals with the big twist at the end of Dead Space 1. Nicole, Isaac's girlfriend, is dead. She killed herself to escape the disaster of Ishimura, and Isaac never really gets a chance to properly process her death. 3 years take place between Dead Space 1 and 2, but Isaac remembers none of that time. So when we rejoin him at the start of the game, the wound of Nicole's death is still very fresh. This whole concept is easily the best part of the story and is some of the best writing in the entire franchise.
Why do you keep fighting me? Why can't you let go?
Because you are my everything. And if I let you go, I've got nothing left.
Step 4. Acceptance. Now you're ready to finish this.
Isaac is literally haunted by Nicole being manifested by his dementia, and has literally no choice but to face her. This is another interesting facet of Strauss's inclusion in the story too. The parallels between Strauss and Isaac mean that Strauss's broken psyche and eventual death are what await Isaac if he doesn't face his guilt head on. All this leads to one of the most potent moments in the series, and the best and most dramatic boss fight in the whole franchise. I really might do a deeper dive into the story of the Dead Space games because there's just so much here worth talking about. In terms of Dead Space's 2 overall impact on the larger world of Dead Space, I think once again, Visceral Games did a great job. The objective and functionality of the markers is explored in further depth and is absolutely fascinating to see fleshed out. While Convergence's true purpose isn't revealed until Dead Space 3, the concept itself was first introduced in this game and plays a major part in the story. You also get to see more of the Unitology of religion and how deep rooted it is in Dead Space's society. You even visit the Unitology Recruitment Center that gives off major Scientology vibes, and the two religions have a ton of interesting parallels. You find out a ton more about EarthGov and the experiments they are running on people affected by the markers and the markers themselves. The main human antagonist of the game is even an official for EarthGov who needs Isaac dead so he can't destroy the marker they made. EarthGov made another marker that caused the deaths of thousands of people. At this point in the universe, this is like the 4th time that has happened. Real classy, EarthGov. Sequels can be a hard thing to get right, and if you ask me, Dead Space 2 is an example of a sequel that just did everything right. The horror may not hit as well the second time around, but nearly every other aspect of the game does. The gameplay is tighter and smoother, the story is bigger and better, and even the graphics are improved. I mean, both games were PlayStation 3 games, so it's not much better, but I think Visceral managed to make a cleaner looking game within the same generation. Dead Space is still a classic, and I love it to death, but Dead Space 2? Dead Space 2 is on a whole nother level for me. I legitimately think I've played Dead Space 2 more than any other game in my entire life. It just has a very special place in my heart, so thanks for listening to me rant about it for however long this video ends up being. Obviously, check the game out if you haven't, it really is that good. And look, I didn't forget about the Severed DLC that was on consoles. It'll be featured in another video. I'm grouping it in with all the other spin-off games like Extraction, Ignition, and even the surprisingly great mobile game. That video might take me a while, but if you want to see it when it comes out, then don't forget to subscribe. And yes, there is multiplayer for Dead Space 2, but I don't remember my EA login, and I don't care enough to get a new one. As far as I know, some people still play it, and I remember it being pretty fun. You know, despite being considered by a lot of people to be a cult hit, Dead Space has just a ton of spin-off media. The Dead Space franchise pretty much has a toe in all forms of entertainment. Everything from animated tie-in movies to comic books to regular books. Okay, well maybe just those, but still, there's a surprising amount of Dead Space spin-off material, and most of it is fascinating in its own way. So welcome to Tin Max, I'm Tin, and today I want to talk about some of that media in this here video. Mostly the spin-off games and DLCs, but I'll touch on some of the other stuff too briefly. I won't talk about major spoilers for any of the games or media brought up in this video, but spoilers for Dead Space and Dead Space 2 are fair game. You should really play both of them before reading or playing any of these anyway, so at that point it's on you. Some of my favorite aspects of all of these spin-offs is how they tie into the main games, and it's kind of hard to talk about that without bringing up spoilers for said games. I do have videos on both Dead Space and Dead Space 2, so check those out if you're interested, and then let's go. First, let's talk about the animated movies because, well, just because. EA released 2 animated movies that tie in directly with the first 2 games. Dead Space Downfall showed the discovery of the marker on Aegis 7 and a bit of how it led to the fall of the colony. More importantly, it showed more of how the necromorph infection made its way to the Ishimura and spread throughout the crew. Downfall also introduces the chief of security of the Ishimura, Elisa Vincent. Elisa? Whatever, who is more or less the main character of the movie. Alyssa is a neat character that you never really see anything from in the actual games outside of text logs, I guess. I personally would genuinely love to see more of her, and I think she'd be a great character to explore more of in the future. You know, if EA is taking suggestions. Just kidding, I know they're not. Anyway, the movie itself is just kind of okay, to be honest. If you like Dead Space, then you'll probably get at least some enjoyment out of it. After all, it does fit in nicely with the story of the first game for the most part, so it works well as a companion piece. Not sure how much of it, if any, is canon at this point, but I don't see any reason it couldn't be. As far as I know, it doesn't directly contradict the games in any notable ways, so there's that. Also, the Dead Space remake had a direct reference to Alyssa, so there's that too. Check it out if you're interested. I do think it's worth a watch as long as you don't spend money on it. Now, the second movie, Dead Space Aftermath, is unfortunately more important from a lore standpoint while being a much worse movie. I don't like Aftermath much at all, if the previous sentence didn't give it away, but it does provide the origin of a very important character in Dead Space 2, Nolan Strauss. Aftermath lives up to its name, as the story is about Nolan and a team of some other people whose names I'm not going to remember, as they are sent to Aegis 7 post Dead Space 1. Long story short, they find a surviving piece of marker, and a new outbreak breaks out aboard their ship, the USG O'Bannon. Nolan, who is cheating on his wife, by the way, kills his wife and son after the marker forces him to see them as necromorphs. Hence this whole deal with him being crazy in Dead Space 2. The story is broken up into each team member's retelling of the events from their perspectives, and each retelling comes with its own animation style. Love that. Zero issue with that. What I do have an issue with is, and what might honestly be ruining the whole thing for me, is the god-awful 3D animated sections that make up the in-between bits. I just hate it. I hate looking at it. I will say that the story has its interesting moments, but none of the characters are very sympathetic besides Joe, and even then, It's a nice tie-in between Dead Space 1 and 2, but honestly the game does a good enough job filling in the gaps that you're not missing much if you skip this. Last thing I want to mention before we get into the actual spin-off games is one of the spin-off books, Dead Space Martyr, written by B.K. Evanson. The reason this book is so great is because it tells the origin of a massive piece of Dead Space lore. Martyr tells the story of the discovery of the first black marker on Earth, and the quote-unquote founder of unitology, Michael Altman. In a lot of ways, this is the true origin of Dead Space, and all the events that take place in the games kick off here. That alone is super cool and is worth a read for Dead Space fans, but it's also a pretty good book on its own, from memory at least. I haven't read it in literally years. It does seem like the reception for the book is overall positive, so I do recommend giving it a read if you're willing to shell out $60 or $80 to buy it. Alright, enough with the bullshit. Let's get into the good stuff. Starting with what's probably the most robust of the spin-off games, Dead Space Extraction. Extraction was originally released as a Nintendo Wii exclusive, which is important to keep in mind when comparing it to the rest of the Dead Space franchise. The limitations of the Wii played a massive role in how the game ended up looking and playing. They couldn't make a proper Dead Space game for the console, so instead they made an on-the-rails arcade shooter that utilized the Wii's motion controls. That pretty much just means you don't have much, if any, control of your character. It plays like those arcade shooters where you hold a fake gun and shoot at the screen, except for now it's a Wii remote. I actually think that this makes a lot of sense as a way to adapt the series to a weaker system like the Wii. Now, full disclosure, I played the PS3 port of the game that was released alongside Dead Space 2. You can still use motion controls by way of the PlayStation Move controller, but you can also just use the joysticks of the DualShock if you so choose. Now, the thing with Extraction is it also has co-op, and the co-op is easily the best way to play the game. You and another person can jump into the game and shoot the limbs off of necromorphs as a team, and it's honestly pretty fun. However, it does sometimes feel like the game was built around playing in co-op rather than single player, which can make playing it by yourself much less fun. The number of enemies you face off against is very often overwhelming in single player in a way that's more frustrating than intense. Trying to grab ammo and other items in the environment is one of the most annoying things in this game because you have no control over when and where the camera moves, aside from the limited time moments when you can sort of look around you, but you still need to be very quick to grab anything you actually want. Having another person to do this with increases your chance of actually getting what you need or want by just a whole bunch. You grab items and ammo using kinesis, which makes sense in universe but is very annoying in practice. It manages to be this bizarre combination of incredibly precise and not precise at all. So many times playing this game I missed what I was aiming for because the camera moved ever so slightly enough that the item I was aiming for was no longer where it was when I went to pick it up. It takes like 8 tries to grab items sometimes, which sucks when you don't have time for 8 attempts. Stasis returns for Extraction, but again, it's almost too precise for its own good. You have to be spot on with your stasis aim in a way that you don't have to in regular Dead Space, which I get is part of the challenge of the gameplay, but considering how much the camera moves and how fast the enemies are, it would be nice if it was a little bit more forgiving. All the weapons from Dead Space return, along with a couple of new ones, and admittedly there is a loss of uniqueness to them when applied to this kind of gameplay. They feel more interchangeable than they do in base Dead Space, and that's kind of lame. There are also some new necromorphs hanging around, like these weird lame flying things that are lame, and I'm glad we never see them again. A much better addition is the grabber enemies, which are actually a rework of a necro cut from the original Dead Space. I would love to see the grabber enemies make a return in future games, if EA ever actually gives us future games. Look, to sum it up, the gameplay can be annoying when playing by yourself, but it is still a fun co-op game, and of course, there is the story. For me, the story is where Extraction shines. It does what Downfall does, but in a more expanded and significant way. The majority of the game is spent playing as Nathan McNeil, a detective working on the Aegis 7 colony, and through his eyes you get to watch the outbreak firsthand. Along the way, he teams up with Gabe Weller and Lexine Murdoch, who are important to remember for later in this video. Extraction is fascinating for that point alone. Seeing the downfall of the colony and Ishimura through the eyes of these survivors is super cool, and the connections to the first game are so awesome to discover. It is the best prequel to Dead Space out there, and if you're a Dead Space fan, you should check it out for that reason alone. Or you could just watch a compilation of the cutscenes on YouTube. That would also work. Now let's move on from a good prequel game to a nothing prequel game. This one will be quick because we're talking about Dead Space Ignition, a puzzle game that was released as a prequel for Dead Space 2. Were you just dying to know the origin of that one guy who wakes up Isaac at the beginning of Dead Space 2, only to immediately and violently be murdered right in front of you? No? Well, no one else was either, but this game is going to tell you anyway. To sum it up, this story isn't interesting, and it's presented in very simple animated cutscenes. It does technically show some of the outbreak aboard the Sprawl, I guess, but not much, and only in this lackluster motion comic style. I don't remember any of the characters, even the one you play as, and the gameplay is just some weird puzzles. It kind of just all adds up to a big pile of nothing, and I found literally nothing of value in this experience. Having an Ignition save file on your console did open some special rooms in the main game for Dead Space 2, but even the stuff you find in there is just kind of nothing. So yeah, anyway, Dead Space had a mobile game that was actually pretty great. Seriously, the mobile game for Dead Space was surprisingly good. I remember playing it on my Sony Xperia phone that had a controller layout instead of a keyboard, and I played it a bunch when I probably should have been paying attention in school. It is straight up just a solid Dead Space game on a smaller screen. All of the Dead Spacey things are present, such as kinesis, stasis, corpse stomping, the whole shebang. Naturally, it had some limitations due to being exclusive to phones, but it was a ton of fun, and the mechanics were all pretty well translated to the touchscreen. I mean, I had the advantage of my phone being part game controller, but still. Even the story was somewhat significant to the lore of Dead Space. You play as a fresh unitologist recruit named Vandal, who was sent on a secret mission for the church, and that mission leads to the outbreak aboard the Sprawl. Kind of a big deal. In Dead Space 2, you can even find audio logs left by Vandal, and I just love connecting threads like that. Dead Space Mobile has, and I'm saying this completely unironically, some of the best marker-induced hallucinations in the entire series. It is truly a full-fledged Dead Space experience catered for smartphones, and the only downside is that you literally cannot play it, which actually, saying that now, is pretty massive downside. Unfortunately, it is no longer available to download officially, and even emulating it can lead to mixed results. It's kind of a shame because Dead Space Mobile is a fantastic companion game to Dead Space 2, and there's just no way to experience it for yourself. Iron Monkey Studios really nailed this one, and fans should be able to play it. Yeah, you could at least do that, right? No? No? Yeah, okay. Okay, last but definitely not least, I want to mention the Severed DLC that was exclusive to consoles. Severed was a story DLC for Dead Space 2 that added 2 new chapters with a new playable character and its own story separate from the main game. Said playable character is none other than Gabe Weller from Extraction, and his story is all about getting to Lexine, also from Extraction, before some weird shadow cult organization does. The story is neat and introduces some interesting plot threads that are now deader than Dead Space 2's multiplayer servers. Kinda sucks we never got to see the follow-up to Severed because there was so much potential there. Gameplay wise, Severed was very similar to the main game, with Gabe even reusing Isaac's animations and even some sounds. It did bring back Twitchers from OG Dead Space, so that's something. Twitchers are cool, but my god are they a pain to deal with. Playing through the 2 chapters the DLC offers is also neat because Gabe is basically moving in the opposite direction from Isaac, meaning the actions of one end up being an obstacle for the other, and I, once again, love stuff like that. Unfortunately, Severed was never made available for PC versions, so console remains the only way to play it. I think it's only like $7, so if you're dying to play more of the best Dead Space game, then it is well worth checking out. And that's all I'm going to talk about today. I know there's probably a ton more out there but that I didn't mention, but I feel like these are the most significant, not counting the comic books, I guess. I will eventually have to talk about the time EA took the true ending of Dead Space 3 and slapped it behind a paywall, also known as the Awakened DLC, but not today. That can wait till the Dead Space 3 video. All of these additional entries in the world of Dead Space were so important to me for a while because it seemed like we were never getting new Dead Space content again. Look, the remake was great, but I would have much rather preferred having Dead Space 4, and now that it once again seems like we're not getting any new Dead Space for ever, potentially, these spin-off games are once again all that we got left. I think they are all fascinating in their own ways, and I love exploring the different parts of the Dead Space universe, even if, you know, not all of them are great. If you're a Dead Space fan, then you should check these out if you can. If not, hey, you made it this far in the video, so that's something, right? Dead Space 3 is easily the worst mainline entry in the Dead Space franchise. I specify mainline because Initiation exists, and despite all its flaws, Dead Space 3 is definitely better than that slideshow compilation disguised as a video game. Still, Dead Space 3 is often considered the game that killed the franchise, the first time at least, and there's been a lot of talk over the years about just what went wrong with the game. Personally, I didn't hate Dead Space 3 when it first launched. The first 2 games already cemented my love for the series, and I was super hyped for whatever the devs cooked up next. In fact, I was so excited that I replayed the demo for the game dozens of times because my impatient ass just could not wait for the full game. When it did eventually release and I got to experience the full game and everything it had to offer, I had a fun time with it. I never thought that it was as good as its predecessors, but to me it was still more Dead Space to play, and it was exciting to dig through the new lore it brought to the universe. Overall, I liked the game, but I didn't love it. It never got close to being anywhere near the first 2 in terms of how much I liked it, but still, I didn't hate the game. However, that was 11ish years ago, and since then I have played the game many times. In fact, I just replayed it for this very video, and during said recent playthrough, I realized something about my relationship with this game. Every time I play Dead Space 3, I hate it just a little bit more. Maybe I've just got more critical over the years, or maybe the flaws of the game just become more and more apparent with every subsequent playthrough, but either way, the more I play this game, the less I like it. I still don't hate it, mind you, and I still believe that there is a lot to like about this game, or at the very least, there are some things to like about this game. Even now, there are still aspects of this game that I love and wish were present in a better game. Oh yeah, welcome to the channel. I am Tin from Tin Max, and I am a pretty big fan of Dead Space. It's been one of my favorite series for years at this point, and Dead Space 2 is by far one of my favorite games ever made, possibly my favorite. In this video, I'm going to discuss my thoughts and opinions on Dead Space 3 and yada yada yada, you get the point. I'm gonna go ahead and get on with it. Let's start with the gameplay, just like every other video I've ever made. Dead Space 3's gameplay is pretty much all carried over from Dead Space 2, which is a good call since that game is still the best one gameplay wise, and no, you cannot change my mind about that. There are a couple of additions. For example, Isaac can now combat roll, which is definitely something. I'll get deeper into it in a second, but Dead Space 3 is the entry in the series where they went full Resident Evil 6. It's basically an action game first and foremost, hence the inclusion of the bizarre and out of place combat roll. It just feels off to see Isaac roll away from his enemies, especially considering that the slower and limited maneuverability of the character was such a staple of the first game. I suppose it makes sense as something Carver, the co-op partner's character, could do, but the whole point of Isaac is that he's just an engineer thrown into these insane situations. He's not a soldier. Gameplay wise, it doesn't really seem to have any practical use anyway, so so it's just kind of a pointless inclusion. The other gameplay addition is obviously the entirety of the co-opness someone thought this game needed. For those of you who don't know and haven't picked up on it by now, Dead Space 3 is a co-op game. A friend can join up with you to fight off necromorphs and you can play through the entire game together. Hell, Max and I played through most of the game co-op style right here on the channel. We never actually finished the playthrough thanks to my game getting stuck on the searching for additional DLC screen and never actually starting. That got really annoying really quickly, so we quit. That's part of the reason I played the objectively worse PS3 version of the game for this video. Plus, I don't want that stupid ass EA app on my PC. Oh, also no one was watching, so there was that too, I guess. Truthfully, I don't hate the idea of a co-op Dead Space game, just like I don't hate the idea of a co-op Resident Evil game, in theory. To me, the problem with the co-op being such a big part of this game is the fact that it's a mainline entry in the series when it could have been better utilized in a spin-off of some sort. The Dead Space universe has so much potential for unique and interesting stories to tell, so why not use something along those lines as the testing ground for co-op, with co-op being part of the game plan from the beginning, kind of like Dead Space Extraction, an on-the-rails shooter Dead Space game with a pretty decent co-op mode that I talked about in this video if you're curious. The franchise was clearly not a stranger to spin-offs, so why not use that to try out the stuff that might be a little bit more out there. Test the waters a bit more before introducing it in a mainline game, that's all I'm saying. Now I know hindsight is 2020 and all that jazz, and to be fair, Dead Space 3 almost didn't happen at all due to the low sales of Dead Space 2, so a co-op spin-off probably wasn't on the table anyway, but they also could have just not had co-op in the first place, so you know what, we'll call it even. It's this bizarre repeated trend in horror gaming where at some point horror series decide that they need to appeal to as many people as possible, so they throw in elements like co-op to try and achieve some mass appeal that Dead Space unfortunately was never going to reach. Dead Space 2 is an amazing game, but like I mentioned a second ago, it wasn't exactly a smash hit financially. This misguided attempt to hit as many demographics as possible just ends up alienating existing fans while still failing to draw in enough new fans, leading to both poor critical reception and low sales. I don't even hate the co-op. I think a lot of its actual implementation is pretty terrible, but in a bubble separate from all that, it's still you and a friend shooting the limbs off of necromorphs, and that's pretty fun. I really enjoyed playing the game with Max, even if it offered a completely different kind of experience than the previous two Dead Space games. I got to play one of my favorite game series with one of my favorite people, and that's legitimately great. Plus, if we're being completely real, co-op isn't even the biggest issue with Dead Space 3. Actually, you know what, let's get into that now. Dead Space 3 is straight up an action game. It's easily the least scary of the Dead Space games, besides Ignition, not that that means much, and it really hurts the game. One of the things I dislike the most about this game is the inclusion of human enemies, a first for the series, if you don't count the prologue for Extraction, or that time you shot Tideman in the face with a javelin gun. Actually, you know what, just forget I said anything. What I mean is that humans are a main opposing force in the game. You can face off against human enemies before you even see a necromorph. I hate that. I understand the idea of an extremist sect of unitologists that wants to kill Isaac because he can kill markers with the power of his space dementia. In general, I'm a fan of the entire concept of the unitologists and their influence on the universe and story, but honestly, I could just do without all of it here. The cult members you fight are just boring generic Call of Duty light baddies that just suck compared to the unique, mechanically and visually interesting necromorphs. It's one of the most blatant examples of Dead Space 3 stripping out so many elements of Dead Space that made the series special. Another fantastic example revolves around the whole cut off the limbs gameplay thing that is easily one of the most standout mechanics of the Dead Space series, which 3 very much ignores and or negates to a frustrating degree. I mean, the human enemies alone demonstrate this. They obviously don't play into that mechanic at all. They are just boring regular people with boring regular limbs. Past that, even the new necromorphs Dead Space 3 introduces fail to fit in with what the series has done so well before. The worst offenders are the fodder necros, which are just, again, regular looking people but with ice picks and glowing eyes. They look like basic ass zombies, but with the added gimmick of splitting in half at the waist when enough damage is done. At which point either the legs or the torso transform into what is essentially just a lurker that's easier to hit. Lame. Fodders are so goddamn lame, and the game is littered with them. They are everywhere, despite being the most unimaginative necros ever. And it's not like the rest of the new necros the game introduces are any better. I remember a lot of talk about the new feeder necros before 3 was even released, and the lore behind them is pretty neat. Feeders being a result of chowing down on necromorph flesh. Cool concept, but in game they just look like skinny humans, and mechanically they are just a pack from Dead Space 2 but taller. And I guess you have to sneak around them or whatever. God, there are just so many humanoid enemies in this game, and yeah, necromorphs are made from dead humans and blah blah blah, but at least the ones in previous games got freaky with it. The new enemies are just a massive step down from the first 2 games, and even some of the older necros have updated designs that just look worse. I particularly hate how green they all are. It really takes away from how human they're supposed to look. Can't really make a video about Dead Space 3 without bringing up how they completely reworked the weapons of the game. Rather than buying them from the store or just finding them laying around, you can craft them using resources found throughout the environments. In fact, you have little scavenger robots you can place on resource hotspots that will collect a whole bunch without you really having to do anything. I actually do feel like a lot of time and care went into crafting this crafting system. The amount of options and customizations available to you is pretty neat, and you can build some sick ass guns. It even plays well with Isaac as a character, using his talents as an engineer to build weapons himself from scratch. It makes makes a lot of sense, and it's a good addition in that regard. The problem is the balance of the game can go right out the window pretty quickly with craftable guns. You can make some incredibly OP stuff that tends to make combat a non-issue, and it's not that hard to do, especially if you are properly using the scavenger bots. Before even the midpoint of the game, you can be packing some serious heat, and it can take away from what little intensity there still is. If making your own weapons is not your thing, can't really blame you there, you can still use blueprints to create existing guns along with some new-ish ones. There's even an unlockable game mode that only lets you use such weapons. No crafting. Personally, I don't particularly mind the crafting system. This rule introduced a pretty cool system that I feel had a lot of potential to build on going forward. That being said, I definitely wouldn't have had a problem with them keeping the original weapon system and having the devs build on that instead. I get what the crafting system is going for, but it does end up feeling a little unnecessary sometimes. Also, I find the beeping the bots make when near a hotspot to be very annoying, and my god is it frequent. Also, the scavenger bots are the source of probably the dumbest DLC I have ever seen in my life. For the low price of $5, you can buy a personality pack for those stupid little robot that makes them sassy.
I don't quite know how to tell you this, but you look like a giant turtle. Unless one of my optical sensors is malfunctioning, in which case you look like a human wearing a giant turtle.
That is a real DLC EA thought was worth not only making, but also selling. Okay, last thing before we get into the story of the game, because oh boy do I have thoughts about that. Real quick, I want to mention that I really like the locations of the game. Not nearly as much as Ishimura or the Sprawl, but the game takes you through 3 to 4 major areas that all have decidedly different vibes and atmospheres, which I dig. The game opens on the moon, featuring a speedrun of a necromorph outbreak as you fight your way to escape both the monsters and the unitologists. It reminds me a bit of the Sprawl, and that will always be a good thing. I like that it gives us a nice taste of what average life in the Dead Space universe looks like. The game then shoots you into a debris field of 200-year-old man-made ships, long since abandoned. I think this section of the game is meant to create a similar feeling to that of Ishimura from the first Dead Space game, and while it doesn't really do that, I do think it provides its own unique feel that makes it really cool to explore. It helps that some of the more interesting side missions are in this part of the game. The 200-year-old decrepit ships filled with 200-year-old necromorphs that have just been in some bizarre upside-down hibernation are an awesome concept and could have been committed to a full game. Can't forget the ice planet, featured in basically every bit of advertisement for the game, which is pretty cool too, if not underutilized. I feel like there are gameplay mechanics that could tie into the freezing deserted planet setting that would pair wonderfully with the survival horror elements of the game. For example, when you first land on the planet, you must make your way from one source of warmth to the next without freezing to death in between, and that's a decently compelling use. Unfortunately, it's only a problem for that first little bit, and then it's never used again. I'm not saying it should have lasted the entire game or anything like that, I just think they could have used the uniqueness of a frozen alien zombie infested planet to better exemplify the horror. Regardless, I still like what the game does with its various locations, even if they could have taken them a little further. Dead Space has always shined with its world building and environmental storytelling, and I don't think Dead Space 3 is an exception. Guess what, everybody? It's story time. Story time all the time. Time to talk about the story of Dead Space 3. I'm just gonna go ahead and do a big old spoiler warning now because I don't want to dance around anything that might be considered a spoiler, so hey, you've been warned. The story of Dead Space 3 is an absolute mess. It's all over the place tonally, the characters introduced are fine at best, and it complicates the underlying themes with unnecessary baggage that just drags it way down, and no, I'm not talking about the necromorph lore. It's a narrative that is really hard to defend. Not sure why anyone would want to defend it, but still. Honestly, I think the first mistake Dead Space 3 makes is not making Ellie the main protagonist. I feel like Isaac's story reaches a solid conclusion with the end of Dead Space 2, so Ellie's continued mission to stop the markers makes her the perfect candidate to replace him, while still having him around. I understand the desire to bring him back. He's a fan favorite, and he's been our point of view for the story for 2 games now, but just let the man rest. He's been through enough. Second mistake the story makes is with the playable character the co-op player gets stuck with, John Carver. Is his first name John? I genuinely can't remember, and I could look it up, but I'm not gonna do that. I don't really have anything against Carver. I think he's fine as a character, mostly. The problem with him more so involves how the game chooses to incorporate him into the story, or rather how it doesn't incorporate him into the story. In single player, it feels like the game forgets he exists until the last third of the game, so it has to scramble to give him a character arc in the closing chapters of the story. It feels rushed, or worse, forced, and it doesn't exactly help to make him a compelling or relatable character. At least in co-op mode, there is a bit more development, but it still falls way short. When Max and I were playing through Dead Space 3, I barely felt any narrative difference in nearly every cutscene in the game, despite Carver supposedly being with Isaac literally all of the time. Just like with single player, it didn't seem like the story remembered he existed until the back half of the game. It's bizarre to me because the differences in the story between single player and co-op were barely noticeable when they should be fairly significant. There are co-op exclusive side missions that delve deeper into who Carver is, so at least there's that. Said side missions also feature hallucinations that only the player playing as Carver can see, which is super cool and should have been used more in the rest of the game. It really seems like Carver as a character exists in a state of purgatory. He's Schrodinger's space marine. Resident Evil 5 avoids this issue by having his co-op partner be controlled by AI if not playing co-op. I'm definitely not saying that's what Dead Space 3 should have done, but they could have at least made him feel like he belongs in the story rather than feeling like an afterthought. Third mistake the game makes, and this one might be the most egregious, is the stupid goddamn love triangle. Why is there a love triangle in my Dead Space game? Who signed off on this CW teen drama bullshit? Sorry about that, but my god, do I hate this part of the story. For those of you who don't know, Isaac and Ellie dated in between Dead Space 2 and 3, but broke up because Isaac was totally depressed because of all the drama and whatnot. Ellie then started dating one of the most obnoxious characters in all of fiction, Robert Norton. Norty is actually the guy who recruits Isaac for an Ellie rescue mission at the beginning of the game, kicking off all of the events to follow. This creates an annoying love triangle dynamic between Isaac, Ellie, and Norton VPN. My only question is why? Why do this? Who felt the need to inject the story of this game with some weird relationship drama? It's somehow made so much worse by the characterization of Norton. He's basically what would happen if you distilled every cliche rom-com boyfriend who acts like a complete dick for no other reason than to make you cheer for the lead to dump him for the small town horse doctor or whatever Lifetime's got going on these days. He exists just to be hated by the player, and that would be fine, I guess, if it wasn't as subtle as a brick thrown through an airplane window. Maybe it's just me, but if you're determined to have this whack-ass love triangle crap in the game, wouldn't it be way more interesting to make Norton a proper foil to Isaac? Make him a character that has Isaac question who he is and if he's good for Ellie by being the quote-unquote better man. Wouldn't it be way more satisfying for Isaac and Ellie to get together because he betters himself and grows as a person rather than being the nicer guy by default? I don't know, man. I hate this part of the story so much. So much. Moving on from that headache, how about we end with some positivity? There is a part of Dead Space 3's narrative that I absolutely love. The Brethren Moons. Complicated lore made short, the Brother Moons are the final life stage of the necromorphs. They are what is created if convergence is completed. A giant necromorph the size of a moon, a creature of Lovecraftian proportions. I think they are so awesome, and a satisfying answer to what exactly necromorphs are and what their purpose is. I mean, kind of. They still don't really explain where they come from or what they really are, and a lot of mystery behind the markers is still left unexplored, leaving the door open for more in the future. Dead Space 3 even gives a pretty satisfying explanation for the whole make us whole phrase that has become a staple of the series. Basically, the moon for the big ice planet you crash on is basically a brother moon that was stopped mid-convergence by the flash freezing of the planet. This prevented the necros from ascending and forming the rest of the big bad monster. The incomplete zombie moon is essentially begging for the alien machine that froze the planet to be turned off so convergence can continue and it can be made whole. It's batshit crazy in the best way, and I think it provides a gratifying explanation for a good chunk of the overarching lore of Dead Space. The ending of the game is also close to perfect in my mind, or at least as close to perfect as it can be with them dragging Isaac back into the mess and tacking on Carver. Isaac fights the moon, he stabs it in the eye repeatedly with markers, which is cool as hell, and kills it, sacrificing himself in the process. The incomplete moon is left incomplete, and the rest of the Brethren Moons are kept in the dark about humans. Isaac seemingly dies to end the threat of the necromorphs once and for all. I genuinely see it as an all-in-all good ending, made even better by Isaac surviving and calling for Ellie on the intercom in a post-credits tease.
Ellie? Ellie?
The series could have ended right then and there, and I think it would have been a complete, rewarding finale that still left the door open for more stories to be told in its universe. Throw in the hindsight of knowing that we are not getting a follow-up game anytime soon, if at all, and it could have saved Dead Space fans a bit of heartbreak. Too bad EA shit all over this ending with the Awakened DLC. Okay, so I lied about ending on a good note, because now we gotta address the Awakened DLC that was released a few months after the main game. God, I hate this DLC so much, especially after seeing the ending I was just speaking of again for the first time in several years and being reminded of how the story of these games almost had a decent ending, only for EA/Visceral to completely invalidate that ending for a crappy $10 DLC story. Real quick, let me address the gameplay of Awakened. It's nothing special. It's exactly the same as the main game, but now Isaac hallucinates again. They even reused the boss fight from the end of Dead Space 2, so again, it's really nothing special. The story, however, is where this DLC drives straight off a cliff into a ravine that was already in the process of being carpet bombed. Basically, Isaac and Carver failed to stop the Brethren Moons, and now they are searching for Earth. They trick Isaac and Carver into giving up the location of Earth, and dip out to do a big convergence on humanity's home planet. Isaac and Carver escape in a Unitologist ship, arrive at Earth too late, and the game ends with a Brethren Moon already attacking Earth, leaving the franchise on a massive cliffhanger that, with the incredible power of retrospection, will never be resolved.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
series couldn't just let us have a somewhat conclusive ending. As a long-term fan of this series, it's just so frustrating, especially after seeing how they've treated the franchise since. Alright, video wrap-up time. Replaying Dead Space 3 for this video has really shown me how complicated my feelings for this game are. There's a lot I like about it, and it's still a Dead Space game at the end of the day. Hell, it's a Dead Space game I can play with my best friend, and that's amazing. I love that. But there's also so much about this game I don't like, and I really don't like those things. Whether or not the good parts of Dead Space 3 outweigh the bad parts for me as a fan is something I'm honestly still trying to figure out. Maybe I should just not play the game ever again because it really becomes a worse experience for me every time I do. Eventually, it being a Dead Space game at its core just won't be enough anymore. The nostalgia will subside and the flaws will be too great to ignore. Anyway, dramatic pontificating aside, the bad parts of this one game definitely don't invalidate my love for the series as a whole. I still love Dead Space, and I hope these videos, or at least the first 3, help show people why and convince them to check out the franchise themselves. If you haven't, you really should. You could probably skip Dead Space 3, especially if you made it this far in the video, but at the same time, I still think there's a lot of good in that game, so actually I changed my mind. You should give it a try. Or don't, it's whatever. I don't really care either way. If you have played this game or any of the other ones, let me know what you think of them in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't watched my previous ones on this series, then make sure to check them out at some point. I think they turned out pretty alright. Thanks for watching, subscribe to the channel to see more stuff like this, and I will see you in whatever we do next.